Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video on the function of the various lobes of the brain. So here is a picture of the brain. This is the brain. And I will talk briefly about each of the components which are illustrated in this diagram. This portion here is known as the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. This portion right behind it, in green, is known as the parietal lobe. Great. This portion over here, in red, is known as the temporal lobe. And lastly, this portion in the back is known as the occipital lobe. And then below it, we have this structure here in blue. This is known as the cerebellum. And this stalk right here at the bottom is the brainstem. So now that you have an idea of all of the different components, what I'd like to do right now is to specifically indicate the functions of each of these lobes. Let's talk about each of the components. So let's start with the frontal lobe. So what are some functions, let's say, of the frontal lobe? Well, the frontal lobe is very important for things like problem solving, as well as reasoning, cognition, things like that. It is also really important for social behavior, and for voluntary motor movement. Voluntary motor movement. Specifically, or an example of that is speech production via Broca's area, which I'll make another video about. But there is a region which is located around here, and this is very important for speech production. It's located in the frontal lobe. Now, let's look at the next one, which is the temporal lobe. So this here is the temporal lobe, this portion in red. So what are the functions of the temporal lobe? Well, the temporal lobe is very important for understanding language. Understanding language. It is also really important for memory and hearing. All the auditory information goes to the temporal lobe. And specifically, there's an area known as the Wernicke's area located in the temporal lobe, around here. So remember, the Broca's was in the frontal lobe, and the Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, which is important for understanding language, understanding what someone else tells you. Language comprehension. Okay? So these are the functions of the temporal lobe. And what happens if this area is injured? Well, if this area is injured, there's going to be some various problems. Well, if this area is injured, what are some issues that can be associated with it? You know what? Let's do this in a new color. Let's do this in blue. what are some issues that can potentially result? Well, if the temporal lobe is injured, you can have issues with memory, since that's one of its functions. And, of course, you can have Wernicke's aphasia. We'll talk about this in another video, where you will not be able to understand what someone else is telling you, right, in terms of language comprehension. And it can also affect your balance. You can have balance problems as well. All right, now let's go into the next lobe. The next lobe that we'll talk about is the parietal lobe. All right, so let's talk about the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe in this diagram is the structure shown in green. And the parietal lobe houses the somatosensory cortex. So this is the area that's all of the sensations go to. So it's very, very important for receiving somatosensory input or somatosensory information. Things like touch, right? Sensory perception of all of your senses, except your special senses, are going to go to the parietal lobe. So things like touch, proprioception, vibration, pain, temperature is all going to go to this somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. So that's one of its functions. Another function of the parietal lobe is spatial orientation, knowing right from left. So knowing where you are in space is really important. And body orientation, as I already mentioned. Okay? And awareness in space. So if there are any issues associated with the parietal lobe, you are going to essentially lose the ability to tell where you are in space. So you're going to have reduced awareness and also reduced hand-eye coordination. Again, the parietal lobe is very, very important for receiving all the sensory information that's non-special, and also to know where you are in space, to know right from left, to know your positioning in space, and your body orientation. So it's a very, very important structure, especially when we think about things like proprioception. Now, let's look at the last lobe of the cerebrum, which is the occipital lobe. All right, let's talk about the occipital lobe. And this is the structure in pink at the back, or whatever color that is, but this will be the occipital lobe right here. And the occipital lobe is crucial for vision. So it allows us to see things, which is of course really, really important. And also things like color perception. So this one is pretty simple. You're going to lose those abilities if there's damage to the occipital lobe, right? Things like blurry vision and essentially reduced visual fields. You're going to have difficulty seeing things, stuff like that. So that's the function of the occipital lobe. Think vision. And it has the primary visual cortex. So all of the sensory information, when you see things from the retina, go right here to the occipital lobe, which is located at the back. Now let's talk about the cerebellum. All right, so let's talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is an important structure for balance and coordination. It's very important for control of motor movements, right? Especially like fine motor control. Really that fine tuning, fine motor control. So what the cerebellum does, it is a very interesting structure. It's, in addition to things like proprioception, so to know where your body is in space, because it receives input from, from your muscle spindles. And so it knows where you are in space. It receives this proprioceptive input, which is really, really important. And it stores the motor pattern. So it knows what the muscles what signal the brain is going to send to the muscles even before the brain actually sent that signal. So it's able to compare the pattern with what the proprioceptive input is telling it, and it creates that perfect pattern, that perfect movement. So by receiving proprioceptive input and by holding the pattern, it's able to create the perfect motor movement and really regulate it. So it has a fine motor control. So the cerebellum is really important for balance, coordination, and fine motor control. And of course, as I mentioned, proprioception, awareness of where your body is in space. And any issue to the cerebellum can lead to various problems. And these include things like tremors, difficulty walking, and things like slurred speech, and even vertigo, because you're going to have difficulties with the balance. Okay? And now let's look at this stalk here, this thing here, which is the brainstem. Alright, let's look at the last structure, which is the brainstem. And the brainstem is like the primitive brain. It's important for autonomic nervous system functions, things that you have involuntary control over, things you can't control voluntarily. And these include things like your respiratory rate, your heart rate, even things like your body temperature, and even things like swallowing. Think of involuntary functions, but nevertheless very, very important functions, very critical functions, without which you wouldn't be able to survive. So this is the brainstem, a very critical structure at the bottom here. So this is it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and in the next video I'll talk about specific structures like the Broca's areas, the Wernicke's area. I'll also talk about the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex, what separates them, and I'll get to all the sulci of the brain, the fissures, etc., which are important for separating different components of the brain. And I'll also talk about the corpus callosum, which is important for connecting the two hemispheres and integrating the information. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.